Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 5 lecture. So today we're talking about Roger and Me, directed by Michael Moore. It came out in 1989, and this is a very important year for us. So we're going to talk a little bit about the year in general here today as we discuss the film, but we're also going to talk about it more next week when we watch Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, and we'll read the chapter in Pearson's book all about the year 1989. Several important indie films come out in that year. So we're going to talk about the impact, the larger influence of those films, and how they sort of change the business model for how independent movies can work in the U.S. So we'll get into a little bit of that today because Roger and Me is a part of that larger process. It is one of these important films that's coming out in 1989, and frankly, just to be straightforward about it, making a lot of money. These indie movies that come out in 89, they're making a lot of money relative to how much they cost to produce. So Roger and Me is very much a part of that. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the film a little bit aesthetically, obviously, because we're always interested in that. This is our second straight documentary, so we can compare it in many ways to The Thin Blue Line. But Michael Moore is a very different type of documentarian. He's a very different kind of filmmaker, I think, than Errol Morris is, but they do share some similarities. So we can explore some of that stuff here to get started, but we're also going to turn a little later to Pearson's chapter that I want you guys to read this week, Roger and Michael and Me, where he really gives us an in-depth look at the business side of this movie, if we will, as Pearson plays a direct role in trying to sell the movie to distribution companies. So very similar to what he did earlier with Parting Glances, but again, this is happening in 89 as the landscape begins to shift and the money starts to get bigger. The amounts start to get bigger. So he's going to document that, and this is one of his longer chapters, right? This is actually like a 40-page chapter. We don't typically have that much to read. Most of his chapters are very light, kind of conversational, but here he's really developing this narrative in a lot of detail, and that's, again, because of the larger importance of this film and the year 1989. So again, just to kind of harken back to last week for a moment, when we were talking about Errol Morris and his distinctive documentary style, we mentioned that he really wants to turn attention away from himself, right? And he very rarely is seen or heard. He's not really on camera. He very much recedes into the background, and instead the focus is exclusively on the interview subjects. As viewers, we are thrown right into the middle of these interviews, and we have to navigate them as best we can. We don't have a narrator walking us through. We don't have a lot of easy answers. And again, we talked about Morris's interest in philosophy, particularly the branch of philosophy known as epistemology, which concerns itself with questions of knowledge. What can we really know? How does knowledge work? We don't necessarily get that same kind of academic, abstract thinking here in Roger and Me, but Moore, like Morris, is certainly pursuing a social issue or a social cause, but he does it in a different way. So if Moore is turning attention away from himself, if Morris is turning attention away from himself, Moore is really very much putting himself in the middle of all of these proceedings. He literally starts with himself in this film. And even though the focus is obviously on Flint, Michigan, and what happens to that city when GM, shuts down these factories and puts a lot of people out of work, clearly the focus is there, but Moore is a part of it, right? Moore is from Flint. So he is sort of directly impacted by this, or at least he wants us to believe that he is. He himself did not work in the automotive factories, but as we learn early in the movie, his father did, many other members of his family did, and we know that many people in this city had their careers tied to the automotive industry. Flint is one of these sort of founding cities of the U.S. automotive industry. It has deep roots. We learn a little bit about that throughout the film. So Moore is very much a part of this community, and he puts himself a lot more front and center than Morris ever does. But again, they're both pursuing a social cause or a social problem. In the case of The Thin Blue Line, it's about the criminal justice system, really, maybe the death penalty as well, just sort of interrogating these things. Do they work? Are they fair? But now with Moore, we're looking obviously at issues related to capitalism, changes in our economy, what happens when certain people get left behind as the marketplace changes, the economy changes. And of course, this is a story that Moore is telling that I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with, even if we don't have maybe firsthand experience or involvement. We've seen this story play out on the nightly news. I mean, it gets talked about in a lot of different forums. Other documentaries, other films that have come out since '89 have told a similar story, right? And I think we all kind of know this story. It's about what happens, what changes in U.S. life towards the end of the 20th century. And Moore kind of has this particular vantage point or perspective as a baby boomer. I mean, he's roughly the same age as my parents, right? So they're all kind of born the end of the 40s, early 50s, not long after World War II. And all these soldiers are, of course, coming home, going to college, getting married, having kids, starting families and careers. We kind of know this story, right? And we enter into a period of prosperity. That's how the narrative goes. During the 50s through much of the 60s, we have a booming middle class. Our economy is humming along nicely. And this is the post-war boom that led to the big population growth, suburban sprawl, the development of new industries, all of that stuff. We know these stories. But of course, now we look at things a little bit differently from our present point in time. So we understand, of course, now that things weren't prosperous and great for all Americans during the 50s and 60s. They were primarily good for white people, as we know, mostly for white men, like Michael Moore. So again, he has a certain nostalgia for that period that can often be found in white men of that generation, because things were good for them, for their fathers, for their uncles, during that time, as Moore is growing up in Flint during sort of the salad days of the automotive industry. And that's where we start. At the beginning of the movie, we at least get a glimpse of how things were. And that's how people thought they would always be. But of course, things change near the end of the 20th century as a result of technological breakthroughs, the growth of a more global economy. There's a lot of different factors. I can't really catalog them all. I don't know enough about economics or global affairs to really document them all, but we have some idea, right? The growth of automated systems, a lot of these old factory manufacturing jobs that were the bedrock of a lot of middle class and working class American lives, those kinds of jobs go away over the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In a lot of cases, these workers are getting replaced by machines or computers, or their stuff is getting outsourced. Factories in the States are closing, and companies are going overseas where they can operate with less expenses, and they can maybe pay their workers less. And make more of a profit. So Moore tells us all about that. That's very much what GM is doing in the 80s. They're closing factories. They're looking to cut costs by going overseas and working in places where they can just make a bigger profit. Because there's fewer taxes to pay, less regulations to worry about, and they can pay their workers less. So And again, this story has played out with a lot of different big corporations in a lot of different areas. It's not just the auto industry, but it was very much happening to the auto industry in the 80s. So we probably already know a little bit about this. If we're familiar with the Rust Belt, all of these sort of old, big industrial titans, these cities like Detroit, like Cleveland, like Buffalo, that were industrial powerhouses in the early 20th century. They were centers of manufacturing, and they fell on hard times after those jobs went away. And of course, people lost work, crime rates increased, a lot of property values went down. We have a lot of urban decay, a lot of urban desolation. As jobs and people leave, things become run down, crime-ridden, decrepit. So it's a story that's been told a lot, and I think now in 2022, we've all heard it, and we're all pretty conversant in that particular narrative. But at the end of the 80s, it's not that Moore is the first person to draw attention to these problems, but he's sort of documenting this stuff in real time. At the end of the 80s, these changes are very much happening and they are affecting people. They're not, we almost regard this stuff as history. Like, we've read about it, we've watched documentaries about it. But in 89, it was very much still in the present tense. So Moore is obviously documenting all of that, but he's also having some fun at the expense of the big corporate fat cats, the rich people who remain behind in Flint, these people with long sort of, these rich families that were sort of GM, involved in GM, sort of old car people who had been rich for a long time because of the auto industry. So he's lampooning those people, right? There's a very strong satirical streak that runs through this film. So he's documenting real tragedy, real human cost, but he's also making jokes and poking fun at the powers that be, the people who made all of this happen. So again, Moore, it's not just that he appears in the film and we see him and we hear him, and he's often kind of at the center of the events that are being sort of shown to us on camera. Not always, because they're also documenting things that, he's not present for or not playing a direct role in, but he's very present. Not only physically, but just the tone, the personality of the film really reflects his personality. Sarcastic, that sort of self-deprecating sense of humor that he often uses, and his blundering, at times comical attempts to both find and talk to Roger Smith, the head of GM. So again, he's very front and center here in a way that Morris is not. So we can reflect on that. And he's also not relying on those dramatic reenactments that Errol Morris used to some acclaim, but also those reenactments generated some controversy, remember, and made some people claim that The Thin Blue Line wasn't even a real documentary because at times it felt too much like a fiction movie. With all of that, with all the dramatic lighting and the close-ups and some of those other aspects of mise-en-scene that we talked about, the set design, the way those reenactments looked, how they were obviously influenced by fiction movies. Some people thought that was really cool. Other people thought that's not documentary filmmaking. Well, Moore doesn't use reenactments, but he does incorporate other types of media. He's bringing in various elements here to go along with his sort of hard-hitting, man on the street with the camera kind of effect. So we get news footage here, we get obviously interviews, but we can often hear and maybe even see the interviewer. The interviewer is often Moore, and again, he's often visible, but we also get a lot of old footage, old TV footage, concert footage, bits and pieces from movies and other sort of aspects of mid-20th century pop culture, the stuff that Moore kind of grew up on and he's using throughout. So, it's a creative, entertaining, sort of fast-paced approach, but it is a different approach to what we saw last week. I think both films are entertaining. Both films help to kind of move documentaries forward and make them a little bit more engaging compared to sort of the traditional documentary model. So they share a lot in terms of what they do, how they help to change things, their social justice component, searching for answers, searching for truth, and searching for fairness and, systems that work for all people. They're united in those things, but style-wise, quite different. And again, the documentarians themselves, Morris and Moore, are quite different in terms of how they present themselves and their personalities. So another aspect that's kind of at work here, another element that Michael Moore is using, we might call it very similar to what's called cinema verite, which is a sort of French style of documentary filmmaking. I think it literally translates to truth film or truth cinema in English. So this is a style of documentary filmmaking that grew up in France in the 60s, and it's largely just based on documenting everyday people doing everyday regular stuff. Very much improvisational, not really relying on scripted setups, and just sort of documenting real life, but doing that for a larger purpose, doing that in order to reveal sort of larger truths. So I think we get a pretty heavy dose of that when we follow Fred Ross from eviction to eviction, as we see the real cost, the real price of what GM has done. The wreckage that they have left behind in their wake, or when we go and talk to the rabbit lady. And again, there's some real tonal shifts and maybe even some sort of awkward moments where Moore's satirical style might almost clash with these aspects of cinema verite, because when we're talking to the rabbit lady, are we supposed to be laughing? I kind of laugh at times, but then I feel bad for laughing. Are we invited to sort of laugh at her, to laugh at her situation, meat or pets? Is Moore playing that for laughs? Or is he just presenting this person and her situation as they are? Not really embellishing, not reenacting, not getting an actor to play her, not doing elaborate, fiction film style staging. Just here it is. This is a real person. This is how she lives. And we're going to watch it and learn about it, even if it makes us a little uncomfortable. And when she starts to gut that rabbit, I tend to look away. It's a little bit... And that it had a similar effect when it first came out. Some people were a little offended by that segment. And again, others kind of question, how are we supposed to respond? The eviction scenes, I think, are a little bit easier to process because it's pretty clear they're not funny. They're not supposed to be funny. At least I don't think so. There's obviously a lot of pathos there. We see these people in very trying circumstances, and we might also feel for Fred Ross, the unfortunate, sheriff's deputy who has to go out there and evict all these people. He seems like a pretty decent guy. Pearson mentions in the chapter, for what it's worth, that later Ross would sue Michael Moore because apparently he didn't realize what a central role he was going to play in the film, and I think he wanted a little bit of compensation for it. Maybe that's fair. So we have a lot of different elements here, but not in the same way that we saw with The Thin Blue Line. And again, we don't get those dramatic reenactments. Instead, we get more. And we get his skeleton film crew, trying to see Roger Smith or following Fred Ross. It's hard-hitting, it's visceral at times, but he does incorporate other types of media to keep things moving, And as Pearson points out, we have a very fast-paced editing style here that really works well and helps to make the movie very engaging and entertaining, but it would also lead to some problems a little bit later that we'll talk about, some problems for Moore and some criticisms leveled against this film. But again, going back to Morris just for a moment, I do think both documentaries share an ability to get people talking and to get people to reveal some things that are pretty telling just through these interviews. So again, Moore isn't as much in the background during the interview process, but he still gets some really good material from these interview subjects. We have some really devastating interviews where he is letting the subjects at least do most of the talking, and we get some almost comically oblivious rich people who just seem almost cartoonishly callous and unfeeling, and then we get some real angry, working people who are sort of representing the other end of the spectrum. But then we also get these moments where Moore is, trying to storm into a health club or trying to barge into the GM headquarters in Detroit to talk to Smith. And we know that he's not going to succeed this way. He doesn't have an appointment. He shows up with his film crew, and he usually gets kicked out, asked to leave. And I think a lot of these scenes are played for laughs to a certain extent, but they're also, I think, intended to demonstrate just how secluded or sort of, insulated a powerful corporate juggernaut like Roger Smith really is. Regular people can't get to him. Regular people can't talk to him. If you're not a shareholder, if you're not some mover and shaker in the business world, you can't talk to this guy. This guy's not going to return your calls. He's not going to sit down for an interview with you. So again, I think we're meant to see how far removed people like Roger Smith really are from everyday people and everyday life. And that's fine, but some critics kind of criticize those scenes a little bit, even today. Some people find them a little bit distracting, maybe. They're at times funny, but maybe a little bit forced. Even a lot of the critics who enjoyed the movie, and it was overall pretty well received, and as we'll talk about, it made money, it was successful, it did resonate with people, but even in otherwise favorable reviews, some critics were like, yeah, of course Moore's not going to be able to talk to Smith. This is very performative. These moments where he's barging into these places looking for Smith, they're very performative. They're played for laughs, or they're used to make a larger point. But some people almost viewed them as a little manipulative because it seemed like Moore was maybe putting himself in the position of the victim. Like, oh, I'm just a little guy trying to talk to the big CEO and they won't let me. It's not fair. Even though, again, his methods would obviously not work. I think we kind of know that going in. So, I don't know. I'm always kind of torn on those segments. The first time or two that we see it, I do laugh. Because again, Moore is a little bit buffoonish in the way he presents himself. He kind of presents himself as a little bit clueless, just this kind of regular, schlubby, Midwestern guy who he's not really sophisticated. He doesn't really know what he's doing to a certain extent. So it is kind of funny, but by the time we're seeing it for like the fourth or fifth time, and he's like harassing the front desk guy at the health club, it's kind of like, just drop it, Mike. You know it's not going to work, and your point's kind of been made. That's just how I feel. I do feel like they might be a little manipulative, or at the very least, just maybe a little unnecessary. But that is a big part of the film. So again, he's juxtaposing a lot of different elements or even sort of visual experiences. Because again, when we're watching him and his film crew, it feels very low rent. It feels very cheap and kind of almost sort of charming in its way. We know the movie was made for cheap. And we'll talk more about that. It was a little bit of a guerrilla project, and it was made on the cheap. And as Pearson points out, the production values as a result are not great. There's some amateurish aspects to this film, and Moore himself acknowledges that during the press junkets, as they're trying to sell the film and sort of promote the film. Moore talks about his own lack of technical expertise. He didn't go to a film school. He didn't really have a background in film at all. He was a journalist, a print journalist. He sort of ran an alternative newspaper in Flint called, I believe, the Michigan Voice. And then later, he kind of alludes to this in the film. He goes to San Francisco in the mid-'80s to work for Mother Jones, kind of a left-leaning, progressive publication. They're still around. They have a website. I guess they are kind of like a news magazine, I guess. Now they have a pretty good online presence. But he went to work there in the mid-'80s. It doesn't really work out. He shares their politics, but according to him, he doesn't really fit on the West Coast. He's more of a, meat and potatoes, Midwestern guy, whatever. I get a little tired of that whole shtick, but he's made a lot of money off of it, so it works for him, right? Like, he doesn't know how to order Thai food or something. He likes to play up that image. So we'll talk more about his image today. How authentic is it? And Pearson's going to have some things to say about that, and it's all connected to money and how they eventually sell this film and who they sell it to. But Moore definitely wants to present himself as this kind of everyman, a blue-collar Midwestern guy from Flint, Michigan. He's not sophisticated, he's not from the big city, and he doesn't even have a background in film. He's just a regular guy who wants some answers, and he wants to talk to Roger Smith. I don't know if that's a little disingenuous at times, but I think his larger argument holds up. And that's what a lot of critics pointed out. Even if you have a few criticisms about some of his methods, we typically view his central argument about corporate greed and about the sort of gutting of industrial or manufacturing America. His larger points about those topics seem pretty accurate, even if, as we'll see, he might play a little fast and loose with the facts at times. So we can talk more about all of that stuff as we move along. But I'm always intrigued by the end of the film, where he sort of finally gets his chance to pose a question to Smith. He's able to sneak into that shareholders meeting, and he's actually called upon at the end of the meeting, but he kind of gets cut off. He doesn't get a chance to really ask his question. And it's based on what we're hearing, it sort of almost seems like Smith knows who he is, or he's been tipped off somehow that, Moore is going to ambush him, and he's able to kind of, get away or end the meeting before Moore can really get the question out. But I'm always struck that Moore seems a little meek at that moment. He doesn't really press the issue, but he does get a chance to talk with Smith. I think a little later, after the meeting, he finally kind of approaches him, asks him if he'll come to Flint, to see the sort of destruction and desolation that these factory closings have caused. And Smith, of course, blows him off, and he's like, well, I'm not responsible for these people getting evicted. I'm not going to Flint. Whatever. So, I don't know. I'm always left with this feeling that all of Moore's efforts, his doggedness, his persistence, it all seems kind of futile by the end, because Smith's not paying any consequences for this. He's not even really called upon to account for his actions or his decisions. But it seems to drive home another point that I think Moore is trying to make, which is the fat cats always win, right? The corporate overlords, they win. They have the money, they have the lawyers, they can protect themselves, they can insulate themselves from regular people in the everyday world. So we can chase them, we can look for them, we can harass them to a certain extent, but ultimately it doesn't lead to any real change. But if we're thinking about this film as a satire, and again, it's very much suffused with irony and satire. Moore is very much making fun of Smith and GM and the people that sort of enable them, these other clueless rich people that have made a fortune off the auto industry, but they don't care about the factory workers who have always been the core, working element of this world. So if we're thinking about satire, we have to remember that there's always, at least with traditional satire, some people argue that satire doesn't really work this way anymore, but traditionally, satire was meant to affect social change. So the whole idea is you poke fun at rich people or certain social institutions. You poke fun at them and show their flaws, show their hypocrisy or whatever in order to bring about positive change. So I think we should keep that in mind because Moore does want to bring about social change. And I think we need to sort of ask ourselves, what kind of reform or change does he want? And how close are we today to actually achieving it? And there's all kinds of interesting questions that come up, I think, just in terms of like corporations or companies' obligation to their employees. What do they owe their workers? You know, I've always found his interviews with that lobbyist, who he tells us at the end has also been laid off, I guess, by GM and no longer works in Flint. But he's talking to that lobbyist, the older guy, who's very condescending towards him. But the guy at one point says, you know, if you think that a big corporation has the obligation to take care of its workers from the cradle to the grave, then I don't think that's realistic in our capitalistic system. And as much as I dislike that guy overall, he doesn't seem especially likable, I think that point's probably true. And it's just interesting to think about, again, Moore's thesis, which most of us agree with in the grand scheme of things. But, you know, at one point he says it doesn't make sense for GM to close these factories when they're making so much money. They're still such a profitable business. But as that lobbyist points out, he's like, the goal here is to always make money. The goal is to turn a profit. You're working for your shareholders, you know, and if that means you close a factory because it's going to help your bottom line, then you do that. If that means that you close 20 factories, you do that. That's the world of business. And I don't think it's that Moore doesn't understand that. I just think Moore perhaps questions the morality of that, and we might too. But it does lead us to a lot of thorny, difficult questions about our system. And, you know, does it help everybody? Is it fair for everybody? And what is a corporation's obligation to its employees beyond just cutting checks for them when they're employed? Do their obligations go further than that, especially when you have an entire city, an entire community that's kind of built around one particular industry? Does that industry, in this case, obviously the automotive industry, do they have an obligation to places like Flint, to places like Detroit? Those are questions we can certainly ponder. But then if we turn to the book, and I want to talk a little bit about distribution here, because Pearson gives us this really interesting guided tour of how they tried to sell this movie. So Pearson has a lot to say about this process and about Moore himself, right? So Moore is an interesting figure just to think about a little bit, even sort of separate from the film, especially when we think about what happens to him after the film. So Pearson calls him a complex character with a penchant for attracting and amplifying controversy, which I think is probably true. Again, remember that Moore kind of has this background as like a muckraking journalist, who sort of like to expose hypocrisy and, corporate greed. So that's his background as a print journalist, and he's very much bringing that sensibility to this documentary. But Pearson also wants to talk about how the movie became a hot item on the market. So he claims when it was first screened, it was a work in progress, meaning it wasn't finished yet, but they were trying to attract potential buyers. They were trying to get distribution companies interested in the product. And initially, there wasn't a whole lot of interest. Again, the old-fashioned way of thinking when it came to, indie films or just films in general was that documentaries were not super profitable. People tended to not watch them with the same frequency that we would see with scripted fiction films. So there weren't many buyers initially expressing interest. But then a representative from a British broadcast company pays $35,000 for the British broadcast rights. And that money, that infusion of capital, allows Moore and his team to actually finish production. They hadn't even finished shooting and editing the movie yet. So Pearson seems to suggest that movie from this British source basically, for the most part, goes towards editing. And it allows Morris to cut the film. And again, the editing is critical here, as Pearson suggests. The kind of fast-paced editing style, this interesting juxtaposition of images that we often see are very key to the overall emotional impact of the film. But as I've already mentioned, and we'll get into it later at the end of the lecture, some of the editing would later land Moore in a little bit of hot water. But anyway, they're able to finish, and by the time the movie is finished and ready to really hit the market, it's 1989. And again, like Pearson says, this is a big year because earlier in the year, a film called Sex, Lies, and Videotape, directed by Steven Soderbergh, who's another pretty well-known director now, but this is his breakthrough. This is his debut feature, and it makes a lot of money. So Sex, Lies, and Videotape is shot on the cheap in New Orleans. Soderbergh is not a name. People don't know him. But this movie ends up making nearly $25 million at the box office, I believe. And Pearson says this is really a big moment because a lot of the indie distribution companies, and we've talked about some of these, Pearson's talked about some of these that sprang up over the course of the sort of first half of the 80s. A lot of these indie distribution companies did not bid high enough on the movie because they didn't expect it to make that much money. And it was the same deal with the major studios. The major studios didn't fight each other that much to buy the film because they didn't think it was going to make anywhere close to $25 million. So the indie distribution company that ends up buying it and distributing it is Miramax. So we've already talked about Miramax, headed by Harvey and Bob Weinstein. We talked about them last week as they become major players in the mid to late 80s. They become major players in the indie film world. They are a distribution company that really started out as like a rock like booking agency or like a rock concert outfit, very separate from Hollywood. They get into the movie business in the 80s and they really start making a lot of money off the home video market. So I talked about this last week. They start buying video rights to a lot of films that they otherwise did not produce and did not distribute. So that's how they kind of get into the industry, and then they start distributing a lot of other indie films, and eventually they start getting in on the production side as well. So they're financing the production of some indie films, and then in other cases they're buying indie films that were produced independently, and now Miramax is getting a hold of them and distributing them theatrically. And usually to video eventually. That's a part of the arrangement. So Miramax is becoming a big player in the indie scene, and they're the ones who buy Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And of course they benefit from that windfall as the movie is very critically acclaimed. But again, the real point here for Pearson is that it makes a lot of money relative to how much it cost. 25 to actually get made. 25 million is significant. So people's minds are starting to change. These studio executives, these executives and representatives from distribution companies are starting to realize that indie films can make real money. This can be big business. And that's a really important change, right? When Sex, Lies, and Videotape first came out, a lot of people said, okay, it's a small movie. It's kind of arty. It will probably be well received by critics. It can have a short, kind of limited theatrical run. It's not going to make a whole lot of money, but we might be able to turn a small profit, and it just kind of enhances your brand, to have a critically acclaimed movie under your belt, even if it's not a big seller. So that's how people viewed the film. And then it blows up, makes a lot of money, and people are realizing, hey, this market's changing. Indie films can be very profitable. So according to Pearson and a lot of other critics, 89 is the perfect year for Roger and Me to debut. Not only because the financial opportunities are increasing, but also just because of the cultural moment that we're in. So we're getting to the end of the 80s. This is kind of the transition from the Reagan presidency to the George H.W. Bush presidency. But a lot of critics kind of looked at this film as an attack on Reagan's America, because the events depicted in the film and even the making of the film mostly transpired right at the tail end of the Reagan years. He served 2 terms. So Reagan was president from 80 through 88. And then George H.W. Bush was in office from 88 to 92. He did not get reelected. Instead, Clinton took over in 92. So many people viewed this as kind of an attack on the excess of the 80s. Another thing that we hear a lot about today. Right. But, corporate greed, hypocrisy, and the sort of hollowing out of this manufacturing core that had really been a big part of American prosperity for a long time. So again, this is very much the vantage point of boomers, more being roughly the age of my parents. Who are boomers themselves. This is very much the sort of vantage point of boomers who are recognizing that the post-war prosperity that really fueled so much in America was perhaps coming to a bit of an end at the end of the 80s, or at least the nature of that prosperity was changing. Instead of manufacturing, we're going to have to move more and more to white-collar jobs. Again, part of what makes places like Flint work in the 50s and 60s is this idea that in order to have a middle-class life back then, you didn't necessarily have to go to college. You didn't necessarily have to have a lot of specialized training. A factory worker in Flint could comfortably provide for a family, send his kids to college if they wanted to sort of do a little bit better. Maybe he could afford a car or 2, a couple of pets, and have that American dream on a factory worker's income. But by the 80s, no. That option was being eliminated. So really a whole class of people were really sort of an entire class was really sort of being displaced. So again, that's the narrative, and we kind of know it now, but it was very much becoming reality by the end of the 80s. So Pearson calls this a scathingly funny sort of attack on the Reagan-Bush version of America, this sort of optimistic vision that didn't really match reality. Other critics, I have a few quotes here, called it a populist assault on the injustices of capitalism. So maybe, Moore is definitely taking aim at certain aspects of capitalism, and a lot of people did kind of view him as a populist. Again, just sort of an everyman representing other regular people. But pretty soon that image would become a little bit more complicated. But anyway, Pearson gets into business with Moore and sort of Moore's team. So Pearson's job, his actual job title, has always remained somewhat nebulous to me, but I've heard him referred to by others, including people who worked with Michael Moore, as a producer's rep, or a producer's representative, whose job primarily was just helping to sell films to distribution companies. And again, I think earlier in his life, he had worked for distribution companies himself. So he was very much well acquainted with that side of the filmmaking business. So Pearson, working along with Moore's team, they start to kind of make the rounds. They're going to film festivals, press junkets, other sort of events trying to sell this movie to distribution companies, and they're hoping to get a pretty good advance. So the film has a very modest budget. Again, if we're thinking about it technically, we can think about maybe the relatively low production value, the sort of lower production qualities, maybe compared to what we've seen recently with Raising Arizona and The Thin Blue Line, which both cost more to make. Roger and Me only cost about $160,000 to make. So it was made on the cheap, and based on that modest budget, Pearson's thinking that they might be in line for something around maybe along the lines of like a $200,000 advance from whoever they sell to. So that's kind of their number that they're keeping in mind. They want to hit that number. But at first, nobody's going that high. And just, again, for a little bit of perspective or a comparison, Stranger Than Paradise cost $110,000 ultimately to make. So this film, a little more expensive, but not a whole lot more expensive. Still very, very cheap, even by the standards of the 80s. But asking for a $200,000 advance to more traditional documentarians seems like a lot. Because, again, documentaries were not treated the same as fiction films. They weren't viewed as the same type of moneymakers, so they simply sold for less, they made less, and everybody kind of accepted that. But, again, Pearson's kind of sensing that things might be a little bit different now. And part of that is the fact that The Thin Blue Line had just come out the previous year, and it had done pretty well. Like financially, and it was certainly a big topic of conversation, critically acclaimed by many. So maybe things are changing now and there's more of a market for a documentary like this. That's what Pearson thinks. So again, we go to these different film festivals and he kind of tells us a little bit more about how films get sold. So that might be interesting to you. It might not be super interesting, but there's also this certain dance that they play with influential film critics. And the example Pearson uses is Vincent Canby from the New York Times, who was a very important tastemaker at this particular time. I think I used a review from Canby when we were doing Raising Arizona. He didn't love that movie, but he was a big fan of Roger and Me. So he was sort of an advocate for them. He wrote good reviews, he wrote good press for the movie, and that helped, right? That helped their standing, that helped their status. As Pearson seems to indicate, getting good reviews from the important film critics mattered. That might help to drive up your asking price a little bit. But eventually they make a deal with Miramax, which is this really important, influential company by this point. And Pearson describes them in the chapter as a company known, this is a quote here, quote, a company known for its waves of hyper-aggressive acquisition executives. So in other words, they are very aggressive about acquiring indie films. They're going to do whatever it takes to make that happen. So the company, like I said, had already acquired Sex, Lies, and Videotape and a couple of other popular films from overseas. My Left Foot, which came out of Ireland, and then Cinema Paradiso, which came out from Italy. So I believe My Left Foot did debut in '89, and then Cinema Paradiso came out in 1990. But they acquired both films. They acquired the rights. They bought both films to distribute in '89. So that was a big year for them, particularly because of Sex, Lies, and Videotape and the big money it eventually made. So they make a deal with Miramax, but it's not set in stone. Basically, the deal is Miramax will pay $1.5 million to buy Roger and Me, unless Pearson can secure a bigger deal with a major studio. So here we get a good glance at the hierarchy that still exists even at the end of the 80s, where the major studios are still bigger and they have more resources, obviously, than these indie distribution companies that are operating sort of outside the realm of Hollywood. So the goal here for Pearson is to sell to a big studio that can pay even more for the acquisition rights. And eventually, they're able to do that. After more good sort of word of mouth, more film festivals, more screenings, they do eventually get some major studio offers. I think first from Universal and then from Warner Brothers. And eventually they sell to Warner Brothers for around $3 million, twice as much as they would have gotten from Miramax. So they end up walking away from that sort of handshake deal with Miramax, and they sign with Warner's for $3 million. But as Pearson documents, they are then immediately accused of selling out by certain members of the independent film world and some film journalists. They're accused of selling out because they have gone sort of over Miramax's head to sell to a major studio for obviously a lot more money. So this is sort of that thorny issue that I've mentioned before, right? At what point does a movie stop being independent? So if it's produced independently, but then distributed by a major studio, do we still regard it as an independent film? Is it only half independent? Does it even matter at all? Are we going to privilege the production phase over the distribution phase? Because the fact remains, this movie was made for cheap. It was funded by a few different sources, but not by a major studio, not even by Miramax. So it was made independently, but it was not distributed independently. It was distributed by Warner's, but of course they gave it a bigger theatrical release. And perhaps as a direct result, the movie did pretty well. It grossed a lot of money by the standards of the genre and based on how much it cost to make. So I think the number Pearson ends up on is around $7 million domestically. That's just the U.S. gross, I think. So $7 million, considering how cheap the movie was to make, that's pretty good, right? And that's certainly a lot more than what previous documentaries would have hoped to make. So yeah, they end up doing business with the big studios, and that does create some backlash. That does create a little bit of controversy. And it also brings up questions about Moore and the way he presents himself. Again, is he still an everyman? Was he ever an everyman? Again, he's involved. He has stakes in this sort of issue. He's from Flint. But he never worked in the factories. He was never an employee of GM. And as a result of this movie's success, he becomes a millionaire and a celebrity. I don't know if people would necessarily recognize him now to the same extent that he would have been recognizable back in the 90s. But, he did the whole late night talk show circuit. He made other films that were pretty big deals. He becomes at least a C-list or B-list celebrity. And of course, he becomes very wealthy. And almost like as an aside, sort of a throwaway line in the chapter, Pearson mentions that Moore has this relationship with an eccentric heir of an old GM family who I guess lives in New York City. He's fabulously wealthy, as any GM heir probably would be. And apparently this guy would let Moore stay at his guest apartment in New York City, this really nice spread every time Moore happens to be in New York for a press junket or, a film festival. So, some people have certainly accused Moore of being a little bit disingenuous or insincere or maybe even a little bit of a hypocrite himself for criticizing this big, wealthy company when he himself is quite wealthy and quite successful in his own right. But again, there's two sides. Pearson also points out that Moore donated a lot of the proceeds to Flint and remains very involved in the community. And I think that's continued even to this day. So we can have a lot of different opinions on Moore. There's a wide range of different opinions on Moore. He is a complex figure. Not everybody likes him. He rubs some people the wrong way. He might seem a little didactic to some. And then there's also this controversy that I've already alluded to, and Pearson alludes to it in the chapter, but somewhat obliquely or like indirectly. He never gets into a lot of detail because Pearson wants to kind of sidestep the issue or minimize it, because to him, it's not really an issue. But it was an issue to others. And these are the questions sort of surrounding Moore's chronology. So Pearson does mention this a little bit of detail in the chapter. He says apparently, Reagan didn't visit the town at quite the time that Moore made it seem like he did, or maybe that cash register at like the restaurant where he buys everybody pizza, maybe that register wasn't stolen at that particular time or ever. There's sort of questions about the veracity of some of those details surrounding that particular event. Reagan buying pizza and like talking to fired to laid off factory workers. So Pearson alludes to that, but doesn't offer much more detail beyond that. But he does make it clear that certain critics and even other documentary filmmakers, in some cases, accused Moore of playing a little bit fast and loose with the facts. But again, critics like Canby and Roger Ebert, who was also prominent at the time, they made the case that it doesn't really matter if Moore embellished certain things or even sort of changed the chronology of certain things for dramatic effect. It doesn't really matter because he's making a film, he has a certain amount of creative license, and their larger point was the central thesis here remains true. Right, the larger argument that Moore is making about capitalism, about GM, about what happened in Flint, and what it means perhaps for the larger nation, all of that remains true. All of that is intact. And if he has to kind of take a roundabout, less than 100% factual route to deliver that message, that's okay. This is not the nightly news. He's not Walter Cronkite. He's a filmmaker. So a lot of the critics defended him on those grounds. And there's a great quote from Canby that I think Pearson includes in the chapter. He says, "Mr. Moore makes no attempt to be fair. Playing fair is for college football. In social criticism, anything goes." That's what Canby says, and I tend to agree. I don't think Moore is doing anything that would change the overall meaning of the film. But some traditional documentarians, just like they took issue with some of Morris's dramatic reenactments, they took issue with some aspects of the narrative that Moore is telling here, because he does present some things out of sequence for the sake of dramatic effect or for the sake of a certain type of narrative power, and that did not sit well with everyone. So Roger Ebert, in his influential review that came out at the time, he was very much pro-Moore and pro-Roger and me, but he does point out one of these issues with chronology that other people had a problem with. So pretty much the climax of the movie, near the end, when we are hearing Roger Smith read that passage from Dickens at like the Christmas party or whatever, the GM Christmas party, while we're hearing him read that passage, that particular scene is juxtaposed with a family being evicted by Fred Ross, the sheriff's deputy. And apparently those two events did not happen simultaneously. They happened at different times, but they're edited in a way that makes them feel or seem like they're happening at the same time, like they're happening simultaneously. And some people were like, hey, that's dishonest, right? This family was not being evicted that same night that Smith was reading from Dickens, right? But Ebert and Canby and other critics were like, who cares? That's not really the point. So I wanted to share this quote from Ebert and see if you guys agree with this. I'm not saying that you have to. I think it's an interesting perspective that we can chew on. But Ebert is basically saying, I don't care about that, chronological issue, because a sophisticated film viewer, and that is the phrase he uses, a sophisticated film viewer should know, should already understand, or at least assume that those two events did not happen simultaneously. And he goes on to explain. So here's the quote. So why should the sophisticated film viewer already know that? Well, two reasons. Number one, because, quote, the movie was a one-camera shoot, and one camera can't be in two places at once. Now, let's just stop for a moment there. Do we have to automatically know that this was a one-camera shoot? No, and I think Ebert does kind of betray a certain elitism here. Not all film viewers are going to be aware of that, or even are going to be thinking about that, but based on what we do know about the cheap budget and the fact that Moore was not a professional filmmaker, he's kind of getting friends and some other people who had worked with him in his journalistic career, some other kind of people who had worked in the film industry, but again, this is very much a homegrown, localized, small-time production with a small crew. And we do see the crew at times when they're trying to gain entry to these various places to talk to Smith and they're getting turned away. So maybe if we're paying a lot of attention, we will notice that it's a one-camera shoot. But I think Ebert's other reason is more compelling. So the second reason is because that juxtaposition of the Dickens and the eviction, it's too good to be true, according to Ebert. It's too good to be true. And furthermore, did I care? No. This is Ebert again talking. No. Was I offended at this manipulation? No. No, I'm sorry. I'm misreading the quote. So after the two reasons, he says, okay, did I care? No. Was I offended at this manipulation of reality, this twisting of the facts to suit Moore's thesis? No. He goes on to say, I thought it was obvious what he was doing. He was taking the liberties that satirists and ironists have taken with material for generations. And he was making his point with sarcasm and deft timing. So I just want you guys to think about that logic and decide if you agree with it or not. Is it okay that Moore takes that particular liberty? Because again, I think Ebert's right that Moore is clearly making a point here. Right? Somebody like Smith espouses all these platitudes, about the Christmas season and giving and what it means to him. And then meanwhile, we see this family of formerly auto workers, right, getting evicted, and their life is being thrown into disarray during the holiday season. So it seems like the larger point from Ebert here is, okay, even if it's not the same night, it happened at around the same time, even if it was months apart, it's still hypocritical for Smith to talk about goodwill towards his fellow man while he's responsible for all of this destruction, this, the ruining of lives, urban desolation, urban decay, like we were saying with the Rust Belt. So that point still stands. But for the sake of dramatic power and a sort of memorable moment, he takes this liberty and he edits the two things together in a way that makes them seem simultaneous. So just make up your own minds about that. Is that expected and good and fine for a documentary filmmaker to do? And do we agree with Ebert that viewers should just kind of know that that's what he's doing? Because he's a filmmaker and he's creative and he's trying to make this into an artistic statement in addition to documenting real things that happened. So how do we feel? Are we on the Ebert and Canby side where we say it doesn't really matter, that his points are still strong? Or do we agree with the detractors who say he's not really fully honest, he's not fully accurate, he is somewhat manipulative, even when it comes to his own image, perhaps? So I want you guys to think about that and reach your own conclusions. Okay, so just to wrap up here, as we learn at the end of Pearson's chapter, this film did not win the Oscar for Best Documentary, But it did not fall victim to that same, it's not really a documentary thing that happened to The Thin Blue Line. Because of those dramatic reenactments, The Thin Blue Line, to a lot of people, felt too much like a fiction film. That wasn't necessarily the issue here, but there was a certain backlash in part from traditional documentary filmmakers or reviewers who were accustomed to more traditional fact-based documentaries that weren't trying so hard to be entertaining. And from that older perspective, people are saying, well, I don't know, Moore is doing a lot of different things. He's making a good argument perhaps, but he is taking these liberties. He's making himself kind of a character. There are those performative aspects when he's trying to talk to Smith. So it wasn't like, oh, it's not a documentary. They could see stylistically it clearly was, but there were still these sort of underlying questions about authenticity, about truth, about accuracy. So we can think about those as well. But for Pearson, the larger importance here is that they made money. The movie made money, a lot more than documentaries typically made at the time, and they helped to shift this larger indie film paradigm. How profitable indie films can be, how much they can sell for, what distribution companies are willing to do to acquire them. It's all changing because in '89, a lot of these indie films are making big money, and they're making sort of a cultural impact as well. It's not just the money. We're going to talk about this with Spike Lee next week. Spike Lee, like Michael Moore, becomes kind of a part of pop culture. After his hit movie, he becomes a staple of commercials, and he pops up in other places. He becomes known to the larger public, even if not everybody's watching his movies. And that kind of happens with Moore as well. That's a part of this larger development that we are tracking as the 80s come to an end. And just as a footnote, Moore, as I said, kind of becomes a celebrity, and like Errol Morris before him, he tries to pivot to commercial fiction filmmaking. It doesn't really work out. I don't know if anybody saw the 1995 comedy entitled Canadian Bacon. One of the last film roles, I believe, for the late John Candy. That was Michael Moore's foray into narrative fiction film. A comedy about a war breaking out between the U.S. and Canada. I watched it as a kid. I remember my dad liking it. I don't remember it being particularly successful. I don't think it made a lot of money at the box office, and it was kind of critically panned. Some people liked it, but I don't think Moore has returned to narrative fiction filmmaking. Like Morris, it didn't really work out for him. I guess some documentary filmmakers are meant to stay in the realm of documentary. But as was the case with Morris, Moore is very influential. He helps to influence a whole nother generation of documentary filmmakers. And like Pearson says, the whole looking for someone motif that is so central to this film, that remains very common. That remains a sort of documentary staple. This whole idea of a film crew going in search of somebody or something. Moore helped to really popularize that, just like Morris helped to popularize dramatic reenactments, sort of isolated talking head interviews, and certain aspects of true crime that we see today. So these guys are influential for decades to come, and I think we can still probably see their influence at work even today. But as I go, just a reminder, think a little bit about the technical side of this film compared to what we saw with The Thin Blue Line. Again, think about just overall production quality, the camera work, the mise-en-scene, just how do they feel, how do they look, What are the differences that we can track? Notice that in Roger and Me, we do have that narrator. And the narrator is more, very much more. It's just him, it's his voice. We often see his large body, in these various places. He's, again, kind of a character here. He's front and center. Does that matter? How does that change our viewing experience? The camera work might seem a little bit rudimentary at times, but I'm always struck by that scene we get. It looks like we're viewing the city from a moving car. Not quite a pan, but we get these images of urban desolation as we move through the streets of Flint. Kind of reminds me of the urban desolation that we saw in Stranger Than Paradise. Boarded up buildings, decrepit factories, rundown establishments. This is a place that used to be something more, and now it seems to be on the decline. Again, that seems to be a larger theme at work, not just in documentaries, but again, we've seen it before. It has something to do with this cultural and economic moment that we're exploring through the 80s. So think about that. Again, think about Moore's role. Think about the way the interviews work in this film compared to how they worked with Morris. And yeah, just a lot of questions we can ask ourselves here about not just the events on screen, but how those events are conveyed to us. So we'll get one more documentary later in the semester when we watch Hoop Dreams. But otherwise, we're sticking to fiction films the rest of the way. But like I said, we'll talk more about 89 next week when we get into Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing. So I will see you then. Please email me if you have any questions about anything.